Yeah, I think you finished that article, I think, brilliantly. You said China has a problem. It is not the three body problem, which reminds us that the Chinese people are capable of great literature, just as Chinese researchers capable of great science. China's problem, like Russia's before 1991, is the one-party problem. And so long as a fifth of humanity are subject to the will of an unaccountable, corrupt and power-hungry organisation with a long history of crimes against its own people, the rest of the world is also at risk. And that's a segue, I think, into the next point. We're so into self-loathing. You and I have talked about this in the past, self-loathing in the West. We've so lost confidence in our own institutions. The two, if you like, leaders of the free world, as I've been tempted to see it for so long, America and Great Britain, as we talked about earlier, are in even worse straits now as a result of this pandemic than they were perhaps 6 months ago, in terms of carrying their people with a model for vitality in the future. We've got to be powerfully reminded, I think, of just how bad the alternatives are to our liberal Western democratic way of life. And I think in this great rush, particularly in this country, to say ideology's dead, you've got a conservative government, it's found money to respond to this crisis on a non-ideological basis, we need to be careful that we don't lose sight of a proper framework and a proper set of principles, even values, to keep in mind as we try to work back out of this into some degree of a satisfactory place again in the future. Because what we're doing at the moment to our economies, and indeed the way in which we've been prepared to restrict our freedoms in pursuit of safety, is very risky, I think, Neil, and exposes us to great dangers going forward. And I'd love to unpack that a bit.
Well, John, I think that the challenge is going to be this, that we're leading people to expect a single curve that we have to flatten through sacrifice now. And we're telling them that the sacrifice in terms of economic lockdowns is going to be compensated with what amounts to universal basic income and modern monetary theory. Nobody's using those terms, but if you look closely at the monetary and fiscal policies being adopted in the US and the UK, that's pretty much what's happening. And there's a couple of big problems. The first is that this isn't going to be one curve that we flatten. It's going to be multiple waves. That's nearly always the case with pandemics. And I don't think people are psychologically ready for a second wave, potentially in the summer, or probably more likely in October, when the weather cools in the Northern Hemisphere. And that's very problematic for the fiscal and monetary policy, because how can you really extend the kind of measures that we've seen enacted in the last weeks through this year and into next year, when we've already roughly tripled the federal deficit in relation to GDP from, it was close to 5% going into the pandemic. It's now going to be something like 15%. We've got the federal debt on a trajectory to exceed in relation to GDP its World War II peak. And that's on the basis of measures that have been enacted in a matter of weeks, numbered in trillions. This can't continue. It's creating a completely unsustainable fiscal position. And I worry very much about what happens when, say, a year from now, we're attempting to get back to some kind of normalcy. Let's be optimistic and imagine that there's a vaccine in place by then. And we look around us and we find an enormous debt accumulation, larger than that which we saw after the global financial crisis, and the abandonment of any rules whatever with respect to monetary policy, so that in effect the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England have resorted to monetary financing of government as if we were at war. And there are theories in place, they've already been popular on the left for some time. Theories about universal basic income, that the governments just pay people regardless of whether they work or not, and theories of modern monetary theory that say there's really no reason why there shouldn't be monetary financing of government. And as an historian, I can only say that way lies perdition, because it's not conceivable to me that there is a smooth passage out of policies like these. It's possible that you could end up with an inflationary outcome, especially since we're seeing not only unemployment benefits going up to very high levels, but also minimum wages likely to rise too. There's going to be some, I think, inflationary risk from that, as well as, of course, from the massive expansion of the Federal Reserve balance sheet. But if not an inflation risk, and I think in the short run that's highly unlikely. I think if there's any inflation risk in the developed world, it's a problem for 2021 or 2022. If that's not the scenario, then there's going to be a scenario of a fiscal crunch, because there will be nasty fiscal arithmetic with debt levels this high, even if central banks, essentially like the Bank of Japan, become responsible for fixing interest rates at unprecedentedly low levels in order to keep debt service down. It's very interesting to look at the Japanese experience, because I think we're going to find ourselves in that situation in the US and in Europe very soon, with a very high level of debt to GDP and a very difficult balancing act to strike with monetary and fiscal policy, essentially trying to achieve growth and consistently failing to do so. That's, I think, the most likely scenario, that we essentially are turning Japanese in terms of fiscal and monetary policy. I was just in Japan late last year, and it seems like a kind of viable future, in the sense that Japan's a stable place. It's so far handled the pandemic remarkably well, but it's also a place which feels like slow growth has become institutionalized, as if it's almost a stationary state. And when you look at the numbers, you can see why, with this extraordinary debt burden and a monetary policy that is essentially a form of debt management. They call it yield curve control, but it's basically debt management. So I think that's probably where we're heading. And I don't think that's a particularly enticing prospect for societies that are much less homogenous than Japan's. Try doing this in the multicultural, deeply divided America of 2020, and I don't see it working nearly as well. So those are the scenarios that worry me. I think the short-term expedients kind of dominate when you're staring at 17 million, maybe 22 million lost jobs, when you're staring at an economy that's essentially ground to a halt, when you're staring at a bigger supply shock than there's been, when you're looking at a GDP contraction bigger than anything since the 1930s. Sure, it's pretty tempting to say we'll do whatever it takes, but we should be under no illusions that there will be consequences, unintended consequences of these policies. And as I say, if we'd only taken a rational approach to the pandemic and avoided the lockdowns to begin with, we wouldn't have needed to do half of this.
In a sense, of course, we went into the lockdowns and into this massive attempt to feed the bear while it's in hibernation from a position of enormous economic weakness already, because the great financial crisis saw basically a doubling of virtually every Western country's debt to GDP ratios, from worrying levels to quite frightening levels, and nothing was done about it.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there, and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.